My brother said it like he was asking me to pass the salt. You should just pay for my kids without me having to ask. The whole table went quiet. I put down my fork, looked straight at him, and said, "Did my name suddenly appear on their birth certificates?" My name is Harper Vance, and at 32, I had learned the hard way that family can turn love into a payment plan if you let them. We were sitting in my mother's dining room, under the same brass chandelier that had watched every birthday, funeral meal, and fake apology in our family. My brother, Caleb, didn't laugh. His wife, Marissa, stared into her wine glass like she had nothing to do with it. Their 2 kids were in the living room, watching cartoons I had paid for through the streaming account Caleb still used. Mom pressed her napkin to her mouth. "Harper," she whispered, warning me. But Caleb leaned back, wounded and offended, as if I had embarrassed him. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and slid a folded paper across the table. "Fine," he said. "Then explain this." The paper stopped halfway between us. Nobody touched it. Caleb kept his eyes on me, calm in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Go ahead," he said. I unfolded it. At first glance, it looked like a bank statement. Then I saw my name attached to a transfer amount large enough to make my pulse stumble. $20,000. Mom looked confused. Marissa looked terrified. I stared at the date. The transfer had happened 3 months earlier from an account I barely used anymore. "What is this supposed to prove?" I asked. Caleb laughed once, without humor. "That money was supposed to help my family." My chair scraped against the floor. "Supposed to? You promised Dad." The room went silent again. Dad had been gone for almost 4 years. Nobody liked saying his name during arguments. I looked back at the statement. The transfer destination wasn't Caleb's account. It belonged to a charity foundation, one I had quietly funded after Dad died. "You're reaching," I said. "No." His jaw tightened. "You made a promise while Dad was dying." The words landed harder than I expected, because I remembered that hospital room. I remembered Dad squeezing my hand, and I remembered a promise. Just not the one Caleb was claiming. Then Caleb pulled out his phone. "I recorded it," he said. And for the first time that night, I felt genuinely afraid. Caleb placed his phone on the table like evidence in a courtroom. Mom immediately shook her head. "Caleb, don't do this." But he already had the recording open. A burst of static filled the dining room. Hospital machines beeped faintly beneath distant voices. Then Dad's voice came through. Weak. Fragile. Unmistakable. My chest tightened. I hadn't heard him speak in years. I listened as he struggled through a sentence. Then my own voice answered. The room seemed to shrink around me. I remembered sitting beside his bed for weeks while Caleb visited only when nurses called with updates. The recording continued. Dad mentioned family, responsibility, looking after people. Then the clip ended. Caleb folded his arms. "There." Mom frowned. "That proves nothing." "It proves plenty." "No," I said quietly, "because that's not the whole conversation." His confidence flickered. Only for a second. I noticed. Marissa noticed too. Dad had spoken for nearly 40 minutes that afternoon. The recording lasted less than 2. A carefully selected fragment. Caleb leaned forward. "Everyone heard enough. Then play the rest." His jaw locked. Mom looked between us. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Caleb grabbed his phone. There is no rest. The lie hit me immediately. Because I knew something he didn't. That conversation had been recorded twice. And the second recording wasn't in his possession. I stared at Caleb for a long moment. He stared right back. Confident. Certain. Completely unaware of the ground shifting beneath him. "The rest exists," I said. His expression hardened. "Then where is it?" I reached for my purse. Mom's eyes widened. Marissa stopped breathing for a second. Inside my wallet was an old business card from a law office I hadn't visited in years. It wasn't the card that mattered. It was the memory attached to it. Dad had insisted on documenting everything during his final months. Not because he distrusted me. Because he distrusted conflict. He knew exactly what happened when grief collided with money. Caleb scoffed. "You're making excuses." "No." I set the card beside my plate. "Dad's attorney has a copy." The color drained from his face so quickly, it almost looked painful. Mom blinked. You mean Richard kept records? I nodded. Every significant conversation concerning Dad's estate had been archived at his request. Caleb immediately stood. That doesn't prove anything. But his voice cracked. For the first time all evening, I saw panic replacing arrogance. Then Marissa surprised everyone, including him. She looked directly at me and said, Harper, tell them what happened the week before your father died. Caleb whipped around. Marissa. Her eyes filled with tears. And I realized she had been carrying a secret longer than I had imagined. Marissa's hands trembled around her wine glass. Caleb looked at her the way people look at a crack forming beneath their feet. Don't, he said quietly. She ignored him. Mom sat frozen. I could barely hear the television from the other room anymore. Everything seemed focused on Marissa. The week before your father died, she said, staring at the table. Caleb asked him for money. Mom inhaled sharply. Caleb slammed his palm against the wood. Stop. But Marissa kept talking. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just exhausted. He said the business was struggling. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Dad had already been receiving hospice care then. Even speaking exhausted him. Marissa wiped her eyes. Your father refused. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Dad told him the estate wasn't a rescue fund. Caleb's breathing became uneven. She looked at me. After that meeting, he was furious. The room felt heavier with every word. I remembered Dad mentioning disappointment during one of our final conversations. He never said why. Now I knew. Caleb pushed his chair back. That's not what happened. But nobody sounded convinced. Not even him. Then Marissa delivered the sentence that shattered whatever remained of his defense. He wasn't asking for help. She swallowed hard. He was asking Dad to change the will. The words hung in the air like broken glass. Mom looked physically ill. I couldn't remember ever seeing her this pale. Caleb stood beside his chair, trapped between anger and fear. That's a lie. His voice came out weaker than he intended. Marissa slowly shook her head. No. For years, I had viewed her as quiet, passive, the kind of person who avoided conflict at all costs. Now I realized she had simply been carrying too much. He wanted your father to reduce Harper's share. Mom covered her mouth. I felt strangely calm. Not because it didn't hurt, because it finally explained everything. The resentment, the entitlement, the endless expectation that I should fund parts of his life. None of it had started after Dad died. It had started before. Caleb pointed at me. You always thought you were better than everyone. I laughed softly. The accusation sounded desperate. I paid my own student loans. His face tightened. I built my company. He looked away. I never asked Dad for a bailout. The truth landed harder than any insult. Marissa lowered her eyes. Your father refused because he said Harper earned what she had. Caleb grabbed his keys. The mask was slipping completely now. Then Mom spoke. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Just firmly. Sit down. For the first time in our lives, Caleb obeyed. And that terrified him more than anything else. Caleb lowered himself into the chair, without a word. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Mom folded her hands carefully. She wasn't shaking anymore. That frightened me. Growing up, Mom hated confrontation. She smoothed things over, made excuses, protected feelings. The woman sitting across from Caleb looked different. Older. Clearer. 12 years, she said quietly. Caleb stared at the table. 12 years I've defended you. He didn't answer. I told myself you were struggling. Mom's voice remained steady. I told myself you needed support. A tear rolled down her cheek. But you weren't asking for help. Caleb swallowed. Mom. No. One word stopped him cold. You were demanding loyalty you never earned. I watched his shoulders sink. Not dramatically. Just enough to show the truth had finally reached him. Mom looked toward me. The sadness in her eyes hurt more than Caleb's accusations ever could. Harper, how much have you given him over the years? I hesitated. then answered honestly. Just over 200,000. The room froze. Even Marissa looked stunned. Mom closed her eyes. Caleb looked up sharply. I could see calculations happening behind his eyes. Not guilt. Not regret. Something worse. Expectation. Then he spoke. And with one sentence, he destroyed the last chance anyone had left to trust him. Then, what's another 20,000? Nobody answered him. Not immediately. The question sat in the center of the table, exposing everything Caleb had spent years trying to hide. Mom stared at him as though she were meeting him for the first time. Marissa began crying quietly. I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Relief. Because the confusion was finally gone. There was no misunderstanding. No family miscommunication. No hidden justification waiting to be discovered. Caleb genuinely believed he was entitled to my success. Mom stood from the table. Give me your house key. Caleb blinked. What? The key. His face drained of color. The small rental property he lived in belonged to Mom. She had charged him almost nothing for years. Mom, seriously? She extended her hand. I won't subsidize someone who mistakes generosity for obligation. For once, nobody defended him. Not even Marissa. Caleb slowly removed the key and placed it in her palm. The sound seemed louder than it should have. A chapter ending. A consequence arriving. I stood and picked up my purse. Before leaving, I looked at my brother. I love your children, I said. But being their aunt never made me their provider. He lowered his eyes. For the first time all night, he had nothing to say. And that silence became the inheritance he truly earned.